Matthew chapter 5. Looking at, again, the life of the Sermon on the Mount, looking at the personality of that life. Verse 9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they, the peacemakers, shall be called the children of God." Again, this is yet another characteristic as a result of the inworking of God in salvation and the inworking of the indwelling Holy Spirit. What is stated here includes a condition of heart and, consequence of that, a habit of life. So you have a condition of heart, which is peaceableness, and you have a habit of life, which is a peacemaker. Again, it's so important. The life that we're called to live, the life that's declared and illustrated here in the Sermon on the Mount, necessitates a state of being. It's not something that we become in and of ourselves. It is a state of being that is the direct result of God's workmanship in salvation. Again, in Ephesians 2 and verse 10, we're told that we are His workmanship. And it's also the outflow of a gracious, miraculous work within, that's ongoing, within the hearts of saved individuals. In Philippians chapter 2, Philippians 2, verses 12 and verse 13. "Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Now again, you cannot work out, you cannot bring out what's not there. So salvation is within, and it is to flow out. In verse 13, "For it is God which worketh in you." God caused a state of being at salvation. God continues to work in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure. So everything about the Christian life involves a state of being. Again, it's not something that we make ourselves. It's a state of being that we received in the new birth. This is why so many just cannot, they just can't do it. They just cannot live the Christian life. It's because you need this state of being. Again, they may, oh yeah, I'm going to start serving the Lord, and they might for a week or two, and then it's off again. And that's their whole life. And it's because they lack this state of being. So there are many aspects involved in the Christian life. And all of them, in every single one of them, we must be before we can do. We must be before we can do. And the emphasis for decades and decades has been put upon doing, and the being has been neglected. And that's really the key element, is the being. It cannot be neglected. If the being is there, the doing will be there. So regarding this life that we're called to live, and that is so clearly set forth in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." This is indicative of the fact that the life that we are called to live involves other people. And this life that we're called to live is not solitary. It's not a life of isolation. It is a life that involves other people. And the life that we're called to live is a life that requires that we deal with other people. It is a life that requires working at relationships with other people. So what Jesus says here, blessed are the peacemakers, also is indicative of the fact that this life that we're called to live does consist of contention. It does consist of strife. But the child of God, if they're going to serve the Lord in a consistent manner, they have to rise above the contention and the strife. And therefore they are called to peace. Notice in Mark chapter 9, and verse 50. Mark 9, verse 50. Salt is good, but if the salt have lost his saltness, wherewith will ye season it? Have salt in yourselves, and have peace one with another. If salt loses its state of being, it's useless. And again, we get back to a state of being. And we see that we are called to peace. Then notice in Romans chapter 12, and we'll be back in Romans 12 a little later, but Romans 12, verse 18. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. If it be possible, which means sometimes it's not. But if there's any possibility at all, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Romans chapter 14, verse 19. Let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace. There are things that promote peace. There are things that promote contention. We are to follow after the things which make for peace, and things wherewith one may edify another. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14, follow peace with all men, and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. So we are called to be at peace. Now, this peace has limitations. This peace has boundaries. In other words, it's not peace at any cost. That's never so. We see it is not peace with sin. We are not to be in agreement with sin. Notice in Ephesians 5, verse 11. Ephesians 5, verse 11. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Okay, so we can't have peace with sin. But we are to be at peace as much as possible. So someone has a sinful lifestyle, whatever it may, it can be many things. We are to not be at peace with their sin, but we're not to be rude. We're not to mistreat them. We are to be polite and courteous to everyone. We're to strive to be at peace with them without approving of their sin. In Romans chapter 12, if we go back there, Romans 12, we read verse 18. Let's begin reading with verse 17 through the end of the chapter. Recompense to no man evil for evil. Someone does evil, you're not to return the evil. That's following things which make for peace. Provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, which goes back to really what he was saying in verse 17. But rather give place unto wrath. That is, leave it with God. Leave it with God. Leave the wrath, leave the vengeance, leave that with God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. That's how we try to be at peace with others. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. Now, that goes along with verse 18, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably. Well, that's a peace gesture. If your enemy is hungry, you feed him. Well, he doesn't deserve it. That's not even an issue. That's not even on the table. That's not the issue. That doesn't even enter the conversation. If he thirsts, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, which goes again along with verse 17 and verse 19, but overcome evil with good. Now that's striving to be at peace with others. So again, this peace is not peace at any cost. It's not peace with sin, but you do not mistreat the sinner. You are kind to them, just as you're to be kind to your enemies. It's not the compromise of truth. You do not compromise truth to be at peace. Having said that, we can compromise our opinions. Now, a lot of people think, well, my opinion is the truth. Well, that's your opinion. But we're not to compromise the truth. But we can set aside some of our opinions for the sake of peace. Jude 3, we're to earnestly contend for the faith. That's always so. But at the same time, we're not to be contentious in contending for the faith. There's a right way and a wrong way about everything. And there is a right way to contend for the faith, and there's a wrong way. We're to contend, not to be contentious. And by that I simply mean not to be provoking. That doesn't make for peace. We're to be steadfast in truth. We're to be steadfast in His service. We're to buy the truth, obtain the truth, and sell it not. Never sell it. Never. It's not ours to compromise. It's not ours to sell. It's the Lord's. And so we stand firm on truth. But that does not give us the liberty to mistreat or to be rude to the sinner or to provoke them. So what are the attributes of the peacemaker? Well, again, it requires a denial of self. You have to be able to deny yourself. The peacemaker must rise above looking at everything through the lens of self-effect. How does it affect me? And that's the way most people look at life. Well, how does it affect me? The peacemaker has to get beyond that. Because you're going to have a lot of wars if you can't get beyond looking at everything through the lens of how does it affect me. Therefore, anybody who you think crosses you in any way, now you have contention, you have strife. So we have to deny self to the point where we do not look at everything through the lens of self-effect. How does it affect me? We're to look at things through the lens of to do all things to the glory of God. Christ is our example. His interest in life was the glory of God. It is a denial of our own feelings. If you're going to be a peacemaker, you're going to have to deny your own feelings. You're going to have to get past that. That's part of this denial of self. You have to rise above our own feelings. Self-denial shows itself in a willingness to set aside our own desires. Again, if all we go by, we look at everything, how does it affect me? How do I feel? What do I want? You're going to have a lot of enemies. You're going to make a lot of enemies. So we have to deny self. There has to be wisdom from above. If we're to strive for peace, there has to be wisdom from above. Now, again, if it be possible. So again, sometimes you just can't be at peace with an individual. They won't allow you to. And in those cases, you have to just move on. But in James chapter 3, James 3, verses 17 and verse 18. We'll just read a little bit of verse 17. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure. It's not sinful. But then what we want to notice, then peaceable. Wisdom from above does not strive to be contentious. Contention and strife are a great distraction in the service of God. We've all known people who have a contentious spirit. They almost all the time they have a contentious spirit. I've never known a single person who has a contentious spirit that has ever served the Lord. They don't. They're always distracted. They're always distracted by their contentions. They may, again, get serious for a little while, but pretty soon they're in a battle. They're in a contention. Now they're distracted. And that becomes the focus of their life. You can't live this life that we're called to live and be of contentious spirit. It's not possible. It's just not possible. So, this wisdom from above is an attitude of reverence for God in thought and in act. It is to be in agreement with God. It is to view things with a spiritual perspective. We view things through the lens of God. That's wisdom. That's wisdom from above. So there has to be a denial of self. We need the wisdom from God. We must also have a peaceable disposition or inclination. Again, notice in Romans 12. Romans 12. Well, we've already read it, but verses 18 through 21. You have to have a disposition, an inclination toward peace. There are individuals, their inclination is toward conflict. That's their inclination. They're always getting their feelings hurt. They're always offended. It's their inclination to be contentious. And again, you will not live this life without a peaceable disposition. Also, there has to be a preference for peace. The psalmist said in Psalm 120 and verse 7, I am for peace. I am for peace, but they are for war. I am for peace. That needs to be true. And I heard a preacher one time preaching. He said, well, everybody prefers peace to contention. I don't think so. I've known quite a few people who much more prefer contention than peace. But we need to have a preference for peace. Whoever the individual is, whatever the problem is, our preference ought to be, I would much rather be at peace with this individual than be at war. But again, we're not going to compromise truth, but we prefer peace, if at all possible. Sometimes it's not possible. There has to be a spirit of humility. If we're to be peacemakers, we have to be humble. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. There has to be a spirit of humility. That is a spirit of lowliness in Ephesians 4 verse 2. It is lowliness in mind, Philippians 2 verse 3. And it's humbleness of mind in Colossians 3 verse 12. So humility is the inward sense of unworthiness before God, unworthiness before man, feeling that others are better than ourselves. You know how much contention would never occur if people honestly believe, well, they're better than I am anyway. But it would eliminate almost all contention. Humility is described in Psalm 34 and Psalm 51 by the words broken, meaning disabled, as to our own ways, and contrite, penitent. Also, there is to be a spirit of meekness, long-suffering, and forbearance. There has to be a forgiving spirit. If we're going to strive for peace, we have to be willing to forgive. We have to be willing to overlook some things. We're not talking about sin. We're not talking about any of that. But we have to be willing to overlook some things. Have to be willing to overlook some faults. There has to be a willingness to forgive. To forgive is to harbor no malice. It's not to forget. We're not God. We're not God. God forgives, He forgets. It's no longer. But we're not God. But we're not to harbor malice against the one who has wronged us. We're to always be ready to do them good and to treat them kindly. That's forgiveness. You harbor no malice. Then if we're going to be peacemakers, we have to have proper speech. Colossians chapter 4. Colossians 4, verse 6. Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how ye ought to answer every man. Now, the how there doesn't just refer to the words, it refers to tone as well. You can say the right words, but you can say it in a contentious tone. You can say it in a wrong tone. And there are people, it doesn't matter what they say. There's a tone of contention in everything they say. So we have to be careful what we say, when we say it, how we say it. Well, I'm just speaking the truth. Well, that may be so, but it may not be the time. And your tone may not be right for peace. So there has to be proper speech, which means there has to be a putting away of words that are provoking, words that are divisive. Notice in Job chapter 6, verse 25, we read, "How forcible are right words, but what doth your arguing reprove?" What doth your arguing reprove? Ephesians 4, verse 29. Ephesians 4, verse 29. "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers." So we have to put away provoking, divisive words, such as tale-bearing. Now, tattling, a child says, their brother or their sister is playing in the street. Well, that's not tale-bearing. Now, tale-bearing is, a lot of it depends on the spirit, your motive. What's your motive in telling? Is it just to get someone in trouble? Well, that's tale-bearing. So, and again, Proverbs has much to say about tale-bearing. Notice in Proverbs, let's go over there, Proverbs chapter 11. Proverbs 11, verse 13. "A talebearer revealeth secrets, but he that is of a faithful spirit concealeth the matter." Again, you can destroy peace by revealing secrets. A lot of secrets don't need to be revealed. And to reveal them destroys peace. That's not a peacemaker. In Proverbs 17, verse 9, "He that covereth a transgression seeketh love, but he that repeateth the matter separateth very friends." That's not a peacemaker. That's not a peacemaker. Proverbs 18, verse 8. "The words of a talebearer are his wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly." Proverbs 20, verse 19. "He that goeth about as a talebearer revealeth secrets. Therefore meddle not with him," the talebearer, "that flattereth with his lips." Proverbs 26, verse 20. "Where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth." So if we're going to be a peacemaker, we can't be a talebearer, because talebearers do not lead to peace. Evil whispering, backbiting. Proverbs 16, Proverbs 16, verse 28. A froward man soweth strife, and a whisperer separateth chief friends. That's not a peacemaker. That's someone with a contentious spirit. Proverbs 26, verse 22. Proverbs 26, verse 22. The words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. Slander is another that has to be put away. So, evil speech, that which does not promote peace, has to be put away. There also has to be a desire to edify others. Notice in Romans again, chapter 15, Romans 15, and verse 2. That every one of us please his neighbor for his good, to edification. For his good. For me to say to somebody, so-and-so said this about you. What do you think about that? What's the purpose of that? What good does that do? Does that edify that individual? No. All that does is get that individual mad at that individual. And that's not peacemaking. It's just the opposite. So we don't have to repeat everything you hear. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Hebrews 10, verse 24. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works. We're to provoke unto love and good works. That's what a peacemaker does. So, the spirit of the peacemaker is opposed to the spirit of strife and contention. So, think about the contentious individual. The spirit of the peacemaker must be opposed to hatred. Proverbs 10, verse 12. Proverbs 10, verse 12. Hatred stirreth up strifes. All through Proverbs we see strife is something that is stirred up. That's what the contentious individual does. Everywhere they go, everything they do, they try to stir up something. And we see hatred stirreth up strifes. But love, the opposite, covereth all sins. Does not desire to tell everything he or she knows about an individual. Love covers sins. Hatred not only stirs up strife, but it keeps it alive as well. Keeps it alive. The peacemaker must have an opposite spirit of hatred. And there's a lot of hatred. Our society is filled with it. And on all sides there's hatred. And it's stirred up and it's kept alive. There's hatred amongst, I would say, God's people, but those who profess to be God's people. People that are always talking about others. That's hatred. And it stirs up strife. And the moment you get peace, the contentious individual, they can't stand it. And they're going to stir it up. They're going to do something to stir it up. I've seen individuals, known individuals, who walk around a church building listening for parts of conversations. They don't listen to the whole conversation. They just listen to parts. And then off they go. That's a contentious individual. that individual is going to cause a lot of harm. They do not have the spirit of a peacemaker. So a peacemaker must be opposed, must have a spirit that's the opposite of hatred. The spirit of the peacemaker is opposed to a spirit of wrath. Proverbs 15. And this again goes along with what we read in Romans 12. But in Proverbs 15, verse 18, a wrathful man stirreth up strife. That's the one who wants vengeance. A wrathful man stirreth up strife, but he that is slow to anger appeaseth. That's what a peacemaker does. He appeaseth strife. But a wrathful individual, a contentious spirit. So here we see there is a connection between wrath and anger. An angry individual, and there's people who stay angry. I mean, they're always mad. They're always mad about something. An angry individual is one that's filled with indignation, filled with vengeance, and they will feed and they will fan the flame of contention all the time. A peacemaker doesn't do that. The spirit of the peacemaker is opposed to pride. We've already mentioned humility. But notice in Proverbs 13 concerning pride and contention. Proverbs 13 verse 10. Only by pride cometh contention. Only by pride. But with the well-advised is wisdom. That's the wisdom we've already spoken upon. Proverbs 17, verse 19. He loveth transgression that loveth strife. That's quite a statement. The contentious person loves sin. He loveth transgression that loveth strife. So the one who said, well, everybody prefers peace. No, there's some people that love strife. I mean, that's what they live for. But the root of the problem is they love transgression. He that exalteth his gate, that's pride, seeketh destruction. Proverbs 28, verse 25. He that has a proud heart stirreth up strife. He that has a proud heart. Also, the spirit of a peacemaker is opposed to meddling. That is, entering into things that aren't our business. You don't have to take part in it. The problem is, some people think everything's their business. In Proverbs chapter 17, verse 14, the beginning of strife is as one letteth out water. Therefore leave off contention before it be meddled with. Proverbs 20, verse 3. It is an honor for a man to cease from strife, but every fool will be meddling. They just won't let it go. They won't let it go. Proverbs 26, verse 17. He that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears. Not too smart. He's a foolish person. And he keeps strife alive. The spirit of the peacemaker must be opposed to a hasty spirit. Again, wisdom is not hasty. Notice in Proverbs 25. Proverbs 25 and verse 8. Go not forth hastily to strive, lest thou know not what to do in the end thereof. When thy neighbor hath put thee to shame. So the spirit of the peacemaker is opposed to the spirit of contention. The spirit of the peacemaker is opposed to the spirit of anger. The spirit of the peacemaker is opposed to the spirit of the froward. Proverbs 16, verse 28, a froward man soweth strife. The froward are the irrational. They're irrational. There's no need to discuss anything with them. They're not capable. They're irrational. They're obstinate. They're contrary. They are people of wrong motives. And such an individual will cause, create, and bring about dissension and discord. But we are to be peacemakers. We are to strive for peace. The blessing of the peacemaker is they shall be called the children of God. They are not the children of God because they are peacemakers, but they manifest that they are the children of God by being peacemakers. So again, this life that we're called to live involves other people. And it can involve difficult people. It involves contention. The world's filled with strife. And we are to not get caught up in those things, but we are to strive for peace. If you have a friend and you disagree on something, whatever it might be, you can have a Christian friend, perhaps you disagree on a Bible doctrine. You may have a friend, perhaps you disagree on politics, whatever. It can be a lot of things. You do not, that friendship is not going to last if every time you get together you bring up what you disagree on, to try to force them to believe what you believe. That friendship's not going to last. And that's not a peacemaker. You just leave that alone. Again, I'm not talking about in church group when something is very serious. That's not what I'm talking about. But there's a lot of people who just cannot let it alone. If they have a disagreement with something, a different opinion, they just can't let it go. They can't stand it. A lot of that gets to pride. A lot of it could be that they are of a contentious spirit. But again, if we're going to live the life that we're called to live, we can't be distracted. And we can't get caught up in all the arguments and all the various opinions of the world. We're to be peacemakers. We're to strive for peace. Again, that has boundaries. There are things we cannot be at peace with, but that does not mean that we're to mistreat the individual. So, if we're going to live this life, we must be a peacemaker. And that requires a state of being. Peaceableness in the heart. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us